So now we have a nice simple theory of tense and modals in a sentence. Right? They're both category T. So let's try this out by drawing some trees and seeing what we get. Okay, so we said that T is either a modal or tense inflection. So let's start with the easy one that we're already familiar with a modal. Okay, so John will walk to school. And so we've already done this. So a sentence, right, is always going to be an NP, a T, and a VP. So the first thing to do to draw a tree for a sentence is to identify these parts. Right? So John is an NP, walk to school is a VP. Now we could still draw the internal structure of these, right? But we're pretty good at doing that at this point in the course, so let's just use triangles. The newer thing here is the T, right? So will, the modal, that's the T. And then we just do our X bar structure as usual, right? So T is the head of the sentence. So its complement is the VP, right? So a head plus a complement gives us a T bar. And then the specifier is the NP, right? And that gives us our TP. Okay, so this is the tree structure for that sentence. Because that's with a modal. Now what about if we do the other type of T, right, with tense inflection? So John walks to school. Well, we know we're going to have the same kind of structure, right? It has to be the same kind of structure. Every sentence has this structure. Right? There's an NP, there's a T, and there's a VP, and the whole thing is a TP. Okay, so it has to be the structure. We know, so John is the subject, so we know John is going to be that NP, the specifier of the sentence. What's the T in this sentence? Right? It's not the modal, it's the tense inflection, so in this case it's the S, right? Present tense S, he walks to school. So since that's the T, that must be what goes in place of T in the tree, right? So we put that S in as the T, and let's always write present or past under our affix. Okay, when we put the inflection in the tree, if it's present, write pres. If it's past, write past. Now, if you're thinking about how this is going to work out, there's a bit of an issue here, right, that we're going to run into when we try to do the rest of the tree. So we've got this S here, and this is going to be on the wrong side of the verb, right? So we've got John, we've got our S. The remaining part of the sentence is the VP, right? It's walk to school. Okay, so in the actual sentence, it's walks to school, but we've taken off the S, right, the present tense, and we put that in T, so we're left with walk to school. And our problem is that the S is on the wrong side of the verb, right? It should be walk plus S, so the S should be after the verb, but it's in our structure, it's before the verb. So what's going on here? I mean, how are we going to get out of this problem? So the problem, right, the T position in our tree is great for modals, right? Modals are always there, right? They're always between the subject and the verb phrase. John will walk to school is one example. But that position is not the right place for tense inflection. Right? So if we put the tense for John walks to school, it ends up being before the verb rather than after it. And this is general, right? So a modal T and inflectional T, they're always in these two different places. Okay, so John will walk to school, John could walk to school, John must walk to school, right? The modal is always there. If we use affixes instead for tense, John walks to school, John walked to school, they walk to school, okay, with a null affix. So what I've put in this T with brackets to show that the position where we say T should be is empty, and what we know is T, right, the tense suffix, is somewhere else. Okay, so obviously we need to explain this if we're going to succeed in drawing trees for these sentences. So we don't want to abandon the idea that modals and tense inflection are the same category, right? We just saw so much evidence for that. That has to be true, right? That the sentences don't make sense, the structure doesn't make sense unless we have this proposal. Okay, so if that's the case, then how can we explain why modals and tense are systematically showing up in two different positions, even though they're the same category? Well, the reason for this, it lies in another kind of obvious difference between modals and tense inflection, which is that a modal is an independent word, whereas the tense inflection, that other kind of T, is a suffix, right? It's not an independent word. And there's a pretty basic principle of morphology which says a word is something that can stand on its own, right? It's a free form, whereas a suffix has to attach to something, right? A suffix must be bound. It can't stand alone as a word. So our two forms of T are different, right? So our modal T is a freestanding word. our inflectional tense suffix t is a suffix. It's an affix. It can't stand alone. So let's look at our two structures, right? So we're going to keep the same structure, right? There's always a t in between the NP and the VP, right? John will walk to school, and then John walks to school. The structure is John, present S, walk to school. And let's see what that morphological principle says about these structures. Well, the first one, John will walk to school, that's fine, right? Will is a freestanding word, so it's perfectly fine in that position. But if we turn to John S. walk to school, that, as it stands, is not pronounceable, right? Because we have this affix S that isn't attached to anything, right? And we can't do that, right? Affixes have to be attached to something. So as it stands, this is not a pronounceable structure. So basically then we're left with a problem, right? This is not a possible structure. That affix needs to have a host. So how do we get that S to have a host? Well, apparently what we do, right, since what we say is John walks to school, apparently what we do is we take the affix and we move it onto the verb, right, which is adjacent to it. So we just hop the affix over from its position in T, its home position, onto the neighboring verb. Right? That gives the affix a host, and now it's pronounceable. Right? The affix isn't standing alone anymore. It's attached to something like it needs to be. So that operation that moved the affix onto the verb in order to give it a host, that operation is what we call affix hopping. So this is a transformation. It's something that alters a syntactic structure, in this case because the structure as it stood wasn't pronounceable. Okay, so this affix hopping kind of steps in to rescue the structure, right, to make it pronounceable. Okay, so affix hopping is our solution, right? This explains why, even though modals and tense inflection are both the category T, they systematically show up in two different positions because modals are freestanding words, whereas tense inflection is an affix. And it has to actually be added to be combined with a host. So originally, underlyingly, they're all in T, right? They all belong to the category T, and they're all occupying the T position in the structure, right? So when it's a modal, right, John will, John could, John must, the modal is in T. When it's a tense suffix, when T is tense, same thing. John present S walk to school, John past ED walk to school, they present null walk to school. Okay, so underlyingly, it's exactly the same structure. Right? You put T in the same place, regardless of whether it's a modal or a suffix. The modals are fine as they are, right? But when T is a suffix, it's not fine, right? Those are not possible sentences. So in those cases, affix hopping steps in. It takes the affix and it moves it over onto the T, right, in order to give it something to attach to. So we get John walks to school with the S hopped onto the verb. John walked to school, and they walked to school. In the last case, the affix is null, right? So we don't actually see the affix hopping happening. But whenever there's an overt affix, it does get hopped. So let's say it always does, right? Even when it's null. That's the simplest account, right? The affix always gets hopped onto the verb.